Welcome to the Spiritual Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Alanna. It's my great pleasure and honor, as always, to bring you lots of different things in our favorite topics of astrology, yoga, spirituality, alchemy, psychology, the tarot, the things that we love when we are working as spiritual leaders. And spiritual leadership, of course, is our ability to lead others toward greater transformation, personal manifestation, freedom through the practices that we love. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and there are a few podcasts before this one that explain more about exactly what spiritual leadership is. And I do cover lots of different topics on this podcast. But in this particular podcast, I thought I would go over specifically a technique that you yourself can use or that you can bring to your clients, your students, your friends, your family members, really whoever needs it. And I was reminded of this technique this week because I actually ended up using it with a friend of mine. And it was incredibly helpful for her. And I thought, you know what, this might be a good thing to bring to my podcast listeners. So we're going to go through my 4-step process for changing your mind. We have lots of reasons to do this all the time on a daily basis, anytime we need. And as a good mentor of mine used to say, an unquestioned mind is a mind that is suffering. As spiritual practitioners of yoga or really any other discipline that we enjoy, one of the things that we are definitely engaged in is the process of inquiring into what makes us tick. And there's different ways to do that as yoga practitioners. We like meditation, certainly. We can use hypnosis, we can use therapy, we can use self-reflection, we can simply pause and breathe anytime we feel triggered. We want to cultivate the self-awareness to know when we're triggered so that we can employ our favorite principles. And that takes work too. Any of us as spiritual practitioners or spiritual leaders hopefully are always at least doing our best to do the inner work on ourselves. Really, when we're working with clients and students in terms of spiritual transformation and leadership, it's not that we're supposed to be perfect or that we have to be enlightened. We just really need to stay one step ahead of the game. We need to be a little further down the road, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, educationally speaking, than the people we're working with. That's all. That's how expertise is built. That's how leadership is built. That's how mentorship is built. We just need to be a few steps up beyond everyone else that we're working with. And that's not hierarchical. I'm not saying that we're better than them or have any sort of domain over them. That's not it at all. We just want to keep up our own practice. If we let ourselves slip, then what do we really have to offer the people that we work with? So this is actually one of my most favorite tools in that regard, because once you understand the 4 steps, they are easy to employ. You can employ them anytime. You can employ them for big mental challenges or roadblocks. You can employ them for small everyday things as well. So before I get to the 4 steps, I wanted to talk a little bit about where this process comes from, because as mentioned a little bit earlier, I've been in yoga and spirituality for more than 2 decades. I've been doing this for a while. And I definitely had, probably like all of us, a fairly rocky start. I know that I spent a lot of time meditating and it didn't really get me anywhere. And this is no slight on meditation. It can work, it often does work, but it's a really hard road. And meditation, all on its own, is a fairly masculine practice. It's like trying to take an ice pick at the top of an iceberg and from there get to the very bottom. There's a lot of effort involved. It's not necessarily the easiest route. If you're willing to just slip on a wetsuit and swim, you can get to the bottom a lot faster. Meditation is a challenging practice that uses the ego and the conscious mind to try to bypass the ego and the conscious mind. And again, it can work. With some modifications, it can work even better. And I go through that in some podcasts, as well as in many of my online courses, in particular my online yoga teacher training. But for the purposes of this, what I wanted to bring out is the fact that yoga in and of itself is not a silver bullet. It doesn't cover all of the bases. It doesn't fix all of the things. And in fact, our most seminal text in yoga, the Yoga Sutra, which was written about 2,000 years ago, comes from a perspective that doesn't really address or honor the other parts of ourself, the emotional parts of ourself, the deeper psychology, particularly the unconscious. What's great about being a modern day spiritual leader is that we have more information. We know so much more about the psyche and what makes it tick. And we are understanding more and more how incredibly important our unconscious, our soul, our emotions are to the greater psyche and, of course, our greater well being. And that buried deep within our unconscious are these things called triggers. In yoga, triggers were labeled karma and were traditionally ascribed to past lives. Whether you believe in past lives or not, neither here nor there, even in this one lifetime, you and I have lived through enough things to pack our unconscious with a whole bunch of triggers that then arise throughout our lifetime. Now, right now, this word trigger, it feels a little overused, perhaps even cliche. Oh, I feel triggered. Oh, you triggered me. But it is the word that we use. And I know, or at least I hope, that when I describe being triggered, you know the sensation I'm feeling. If this is a new term for you, essentially, when you're triggered, what's happening is an emotional response that outweighs the actual event itself. We've all been there, okay? I'm describing humanness right now. Pure, simple humanness. I have triggers. You have triggers. We all have triggers. We've certainly witnessed someone be triggered. We've certainly been triggered ourselves. So, anytime there's a bit of an outsized emotional reaction to an event, then we know we're in a trigger. And a trigger is unconscious. A trigger comes bubbling up from within us, likely from something deep in our history, probably from early childhood. We might not actually know where that trigger began. The good news is we don't have to. There are ways to figure that out. I myself am a huge fan of hypnotherapy if you really want to dig back into your history and awaken the inner child and heal all those wounds. I love this kind of work. But for the purposes of our practice today, and also to give you hope that it's not going to take 19 years of therapy to get to the bottom and the heart of whatever's going on with you, there are tools you can use to move past these triggered states. Because what happens in a triggered state, what happens when we are having an outsized emotional experience, and again, I don't want to not justify the emotional experience either, right? I'm not here to shame in any way emotions. I also love emotions. I myself am a very emotional human being, better out than in. All emotions are awesomely okay. All emotional experiences are awesomely okay. And rather than trying to repress them or push them away or deny them in any way, we do want to feel them, but be we don't necessarily want to succumb to them. We don't need them to rule our lives or to dominate what then happens next. What we want is some emotional freedom to be able to notice, to be aware of this trigger and really honor it. This is awesome information. This is great news. Now I know that something like this, whatever this is, it doesn't matter what the external event is. The external event has a quality to it, it has a feeling to it. And whenever you have that feeling arise, so will that trigger. Wow, that is awesome information. That's great to know. And, if you really get into the work like I do, when these things happen, you can have a little part of yourself that's like, oh, good, here we go. Like, here we go. We're going to grow. We're going to learn. We're going to transform. We're going to use this as a reason to move past whatever the challenge is. And even if it's painful, even if it's challenging, and it likely will be, right? But again, that's life. I'm describing humanness here. It will be worth it. And it will be absolutely worth it if it sets you free, or at least freer, of the emotional bondage that can happen with a trigger. When we get lost in the trigger, our nervous systems become dysregulated. We go unconscious. We can't think for ourselves. We react as opposed to act. And what happens with the reaction and the dysregulation of the nervous system is that we actually reinforce the trigger. We say yes to it. We say, absolutely, when this quality of event occurs in my life, this is my response, and I am a slave to it. Well, I believe in free will, and I don't think we're a slave to anything. I believe we have the opportunity to transform ourselves and to behave in according to our highest good. And it takes work. It takes consciousness. It takes all the spiritual practices that you and I have come to know and love and that you and I teach, but we need to employ them. Okay, it's just part of the practice and the path of spiritual leadership. So, triggers, if we describe them as karma, as the yoga literature does, the way that I like to think of them are as hardened loops. So, if you can imagine like a chain link, a necklace perhaps, where there's little loops that bind together to create the chain, those little loops, they look impermeable. And there's a cycle there. And that cycle is an unconscious cycle where we're going to feel victim to the experience. And I don't think that any of us necessarily needs to be victims of our own experience, of our own emotions, right? There's freedom here. That's what I'm proposing today in the podcast. And if you look really closely at these loops, what you'll notice is that there's always going to be a little joint where the loop was soldered together. So there is a weak point. At some point, that loop was created. And the creation of that loop is pretty simplistic in fashion, honestly. When you were very early in your childhood, at some point, something happened. It doesn't even have to be that traumatic or that dramatic, but you made a decision very early on to respond to that event in a certain way. Like, for example, perhaps you saw your caretakers fighting. It happens. Even the most amazing two adults in partnership will disagree over things. But to a young child who sees this for the first time, that can be scary. And that conflict can feel bad. And so that young child may make the decision in that moment to exit stage left and get the flock on out of there, which at that age is a great decision. It keeps that young child safe, it removes them from the conflict, fine. And the caretakers might be completely fine afterward, and everything goes back to normal the next day. So, in that moment, the young child makes an excellent decision for his or her own self preservation's sake. We love this. However, that's where that loop gets hardened into a decision. When I see conflict, I run away. And once that young child is 35 years of age, it's not necessarily the best decision. So when something has, again, a similar quality of feeling, when that same conflict arises for that person, the default is to get upset, to get fearful, and to run away. It's okay to move beyond that, but you have to do the work around it to undo that hardened loop, that decision. And of course, I'm giving an innocuous example here, but everything we've experienced becomes these little decisions that become hardened loops, especially before the ages of about 5 to 7. I mean, it's really remarkable. And, again, I know that we've certainly all heard about, oh, the inner child, but it's a cliche for a reason, because this is an actual thing that human beings experience as young people. Up to the ages of 5 to 7, we are doing our absolute best to make good decisions, but they're uninformed and they're with limited mental and brain capacity. Our brains don't fully develop until we're 25 years old. So those decisions early on, they cement themselves, they become deep parts of our psyche, this unconscious layer that then serves up these emotional responses because emotions are alive at that age. And that's how we know how to feel. So these emotions are signals to us. They're like flags, they're messages from our deep unconscious, from our soul, that here's something to look at. Here's something that we might want to address. Here potentially is a wound that we need to heal. But we can't do it in a triggered state. We have to free ourselves from that little loop. We have to free ourselves from the emotional bondage in order to move out of the unconscious into the conscious, be fully present and aware, and choose something different for ourselves. Now, I know that this all seems very challenging. And again, there's lots of ways to do it, not just my 4-step process. A lot of therapy works through the same process. And I invite and celebrate all of the ways in which we can make the unconscious conscious, in which we can create greater dialogue between all of the parts of ourself, which I've described in previous podcasts as actually being the state of yoga. That communication between all the parts of ourselves, our main 3 components of the psyche, the supra consciousness, which is our spirit, the conscious mind, our ego or our daily personality, and our unconscious, our soul. So if we have presence of mind to recognize that we're in a trigger, and again, it doesn't actually matter what the external event is. I mean, the external event may or may not be a real problem. I don't know. We may have to address it in a certain way. We may have to make a different decision in a certain way. I don't know. And again, for the purposes of this particular process, it doesn't actually matter what the external event is. What I hope to do with this process is set you free from the unconscious emotional bondage that is this hardened karmic loop so that you can break it open, which will at least give you some perspective, but even better, spiral it slightly up. Because if you can spiral it slightly up, what you're giving yourself is not a downward spiral, but an upward spiral. And you're giving yourself the opportunity to have a little perspective, to look more clearly with a little elevation on what's happening, and the opportunity that the next time you encounter something with the same emotional flavors, this event, which you will, that you won't immediately go into that triggered state, but you'll have some space to consider a different response. This is emotional and spiritual evolution. This is emotional and spiritual freedom. Okay? I want that for you. I want that for myself. I want that for everybody. So, I remember early on in my yoga career, learning, of course, about the Yoga Sutra. I'm a huge fan of the Yoga Sutra, the most important yogic text, arguably, out there. And I remember hearing Yoga Sutra 2.33. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the sutra is a text. It has 4 chapters. They're all quite important. In the second chapter, the 33rd phrase is the one I'm referring to here. And I'll reference it in Sanskrit because that's always fun, right? Vitarka badhane pratipaksha bhavanam. And that translates as, when disturbed by disturbing thoughts, think the opposite. Now, that's on one level, that's great advice. But on another level, that's incredibly flippant advice. Because I remember hearing this and really, early in my yoga career, just taking everything I was learning as word, as almost like a gospel. And then really, to some extent, deriding myself when it didn't work. I was so almost ashamed when I tried to just convince myself that whatever negative thought pattern I was stuck in was something else. It was like trying to put a smear of positive thought over a whole bunch of negative thought and hoping to goodness it will trickle down. It doesn't work. Now, I appreciate the advice. I appreciate the sentiment. I certainly hope at some point and wish at some point that we could just change our mind. I don't think it's going to happen, though. And again, this knowledge is a couple thousand years old. We've learned a lot. That book is not closed. We can add new information. And the new information we have really stems from further study and development of psychology, further study and development, particularly of the unconscious and the depth that exists within us. We are incredibly complex beings, and emotions are real. Triggers are real. So we need to address them. Now, what happens when we're in a triggered state, again, is that emotional reaction. That's an unconscious reaction, and that's really where we get stuck, especially when we have a mental trigger, an emotional trigger that we can't get out of. If it's a really big one, we could be stuck in there for days, weeks, who knows how long. It might be something that comes up for us over and over again. So we want to undo that patterning. Now, when we're in a triggered state, again, we can't really move forward. We can't choose to behave differently. We're quite stuck, and we're guaranteeing almost certainly that the next time again we encounter that same type of thing, we'll have the same reaction. Let's free ourselves. Let's free our mind. And that's what I call this practice. We free our mind with this practice. I do write about this, by the way, in my book, Yoga Beyond the Mat. So if you need a visual or text reference to what I'm saying here in this podcast, please feel free to check the book, Yoga Beyond the Mat. It's all there for you. I took notes for you. But the first thing you'll want to do, so here are the 4 steps. I'm taking you through them now. The very first thing you'll want to do when you recognize there's a trigger, a big emotional reaction, you're feeling stuck, you can't move forward, is start to examine the thoughts. Now, this is probably something you're fairly adept at if you've done any spiritual work or work in yoga or meditation. You want to examine the thoughts. And again, not to obsess over them, look at them in a kind of clinical fashion. And what we want to do is discover the thought that is disturbing. Remember, in the Yoga Sutra, the author Patanjali says, when disturbed by a disturbing thought. So we want to figure out what thought is disturbing. Now, the thought that is disturbing is going to be our belief about something, not the something itself. So, for example, if we are really not into Mondays, we can't stand Mondays. Mondays are the worst. We wake up on Monday morning and we are just filled with dread. Now, again, I'm using an innocuous example here so that we can move through the process and just see how it goes. We can't work with the thought, today is Monday. That's an empirical fact. An empirical fact is like 2 plus 2 equals 4. No matter where you go in the universe, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4. You could be on Mars, you could be on the dog star Sirius. 2 plus 2 will still equal 4. It's irrefutable. If it's Monday, today is Monday, that's it. That's not the disturbing thought. That's just empirically true. There's nothing we can do about it. And we cannot argue with reality. So what we want to do is figure out what is our thought or belief about Monday that is so disturbing. I hate Mondays. Mondays are the worst. Mondays are never good. Those are judgmental thoughts. That's where we work. The thought about, the belief about the thing. If we're triggered or emotional because someone has passed away, for example, we can't work with the thought, this person is gone. That is empirically true. They are gone. But what we can work with is our judgment about it. I wish they were not gone. I wish they were still here. I want them back. Why did they leave so soon? So I'm just pointing you in the direction of finding the belief system. That's where we work. That's where the emotion is. What is amazing about our beliefs is that they are never empirically true. So when we land on the disturbing thought, and depending on the trigger, there may actually be several of them. And so in that case, we'll do this 4-step process several times. There might be several of them. Great. We've got some steps. I love a roadmap. So when we discover a belief or a thought about the thing, or several of them, let's start with one. So in our case of I hate Mondays, let's use I hate Mondays. And again, trying to keep it innocuous so I don't trigger you during this podcast so we can move through the process. But the process is the same no matter what the belief is, because the belief is never empirically true. No matter how much the person hates Mondays, you can, without doubt, find in their history a Monday that they enjoyed. Maybe it was a holiday, a Monday. Sometimes Mondays are holidays. Maybe they had a barbecue with friends. Maybe that Monday was okay. There's even one moment where that thought doesn't have empirical truth. It's not a true thought in the empirical sense, and that's where we can poke some holes. We can find some wiggle room. So first things first, we've got to get to the belief. We've got to get to the thought about the thing that is really working us up. And that's what we can work with. So that's step one. And that might take some time. Especially if you're doing this work with a friend or a client or a colleague or a family member, they might argue with you. No, it is true that I hate Mondays. It's the truest thing I've ever known. And so then maybe you'll think about your history and that Labor Day you did spend with them that was a Monday where you saw them laughing and being in joy and having a good time. And you'll remind them. Except for that one Monday. Remember that one Monday? That was awesome. So it could be a bit of a conversation to get to the belief. Once you've got the belief, now we can take ourselves to step two. Yeah, step two, we want to create a safe container for, safe space for. So again, if you're doing this work with a client, a friend, or a family member, you'll just let them know this is a safe place. This is a practice. We're going to move through it. It's okay here. You're doing it with yourself. Say the same thing to yourself, really. Because in step two, we want to actually feel that thought, that belief that's triggering us, that's really getting us jammed up. So if you think, and you can actually do this with me now on the podcast here, because all of us have a certain relationship with Mondays, and we can probably put ourselves in the place where we actually really don't like them that much. So we'll put ourselves there now. This is a safe space. And when we think to ourselves and we really believe that it's true, I hate Mondays, how do we feel? Now, when I say how do we feel about it, I don't need a name of an emotion. You don't have to say, oh, I feel angry, I feel frustrated. The weird yet consistently true thing about us as humans is that we're actually kind of terrible at naming the emotions that we're feeling. That is a very complex thing to do, to discern frustration from anger, from a sadness. We don't need to. We don't need to. That's a lot of emotional and intellectual development that people may or may not have, and even if we do, we can get lost in things sometimes. What I know, is that in step two, when we invite ourselves or the person we're working with to feel the belief that is deeply triggering them, I know that they're going to feel some version of bad. Doesn't matter what the label is. I don't need to know the label. It's going to be some version of bad. And I also know, because we are complex human beings and we are all integrated, that they're going to feel that bad somewhere in their body. So place your hand on your body, or have your client do this, where they feel this thought, this belief. I hate Mondays. Maybe they'll place their hand on the chest because they feel a heaviness in the chest. Maybe you'll feel butterflies in your stomach. Maybe you'll feel a tightness in your throat. Place your hand and recognize the body's correspondence to you. This is messages to you. This is how the unconscious speaks. The unconscious can't write you an email. It sends emotions. It sends sensation. And if you know how to listen, there's your yoga. So for my friends who are yoga inclined and love the chakras like I do, then you'll know when you place your hands in a certain location on the body that does correspond to a chakra. But my friends, that is another podcast, and I promise I will get to it. Or you can check out some of my courses on the chakras on my website, alannak.com. It's up to you. Or you'll just know that this is the location in your body that this negative, bad feeling arises when I think this thought. So again, we've had the safe space for the thought, and that's step two. And what you want to ask is, do you want to keep this thought? Wow, I don't know. Let's consider that for a second. So in step three, we'll give permission in a safe space to completely drop that particular belief. And you can also say, hey, look, if this belief is very important to you and you decide you want to pick it back up, you'll be free to do so at the end of the exercise. I guarantee you you won't. But you can always offer it. If you've lived with this trigger, this belief for a long time, it might feel weird to just drop it. We love our belief systems. Just give it a try. In this step three, give yourself permission to completely drop that belief, that thought. Just be free of it. There is no longer an I hate Mondays. It's just gone. And now feel what it's like in the body to be free of that belief. What's it like to be free of that thought? And once again, place your hands on your body where you feel that sense of freedom and release. No longer having the thought, I hate Mondays, it's gone. Now, you might feel a lightness in the chest. You might feel a warmth in the belly. You might feel a tingling in the head. We don't have to name the emotion that goes with it. Happiness, joy, elation, love, excitement. It doesn't matter what the label is. I can guarantee you that without that thought, when you allow yourself or this person you're working with to be free of the thought, they are going to feel some form of good. No label needed. Feel it in the body. Place the hands. Recognize the body's communication to you around the sensation. Wow. And we're free. So after step 3, when we've felt where in the body this arises, we want to really consider, do we want to pick that belief back up? If we know how bad it feels, if we know what it's doing to the body, do we want it back? Do we want to keep it? If people are really stuck, they might say they want to keep it. They don't really want to keep it. They really don't. But if they're really attached to it and they've been living with it for a long time and they want to be in their rightness rather than their freedom, they might say, no, I want to hold on to that negative belief for a while. Okay, so then you'll start the process over when readiness is there. I've never really had that happen. So the majority of everybody that I know, and myself too, no, we don't want to pick it back up. We want to be free of it. So now we go to step 4. And step 4 is where the Yoga Sutra comes in. Remember, when disturbed by disturbing thought, think the opposite. But Patanjali, in his great wisdom, and there was a lot of wisdom there, didn't understand the power of the unconscious. Maybe wasn't, I don't know, we just have that knowledge now. We don't have to second guess it. We just have that knowledge now. It's the emotion connected to the belief where we get stuck. It's the emotion that makes that hardened karmic loop solid. So for step 4, we want to take Patanjali's advice and not just think the opposite, but feel the opposite. Now, because we're always going to be working with a belief, a thought that is a belief, it's not empirically true. So there's not just one opposite. There could be a lot of ways to oppose it. So for example, if the thought starts with the negative thought starts as I hate Mondays, we could oppose it by saying I love Mondays. Mondays are my favorite day. Actually, I love all days of the week. Any of those will work fine. So working it out, going through maybe a couple of different options until you land on an opposite that has some resonance. There's going to be a way, a thought, a belief that opposes the initial one, that gives a little spark, that fuels a little bit of that freedom we felt in step 3. And when you've landed on whichever version of opposition feels most good to you, then you feel into it, because remember, it was the emotion that charged up that hardened karmic loop in the first place. So as we give ourselves space, steps 1, 2, and 3, separate that hardened karmic loop, we spiral it up and give ourselves some perspective and some emotional freedom by emotionally charging the oppositional belief. So you'll want to, I like to sit down and close my eyes, give myself some space, think that thought, believe that belief over and over for a period of time. There's no right period of time. It could be 30 seconds. It could be 3 hours. When you start to feel inside your body, again, we don't have to name it, some version of good. When you identify that feeling with your hands, when you feel, oh my gosh, I love Mondays, and you feel that in your heart, or you feel a sense of freedom and lightness in your mind, you are giving that some emotional charge, and that is what's going to set you free. And now you have a different way of responding. You have a new belief, because beliefs are always malleable. They're always changeable. They are not stuck. They are not fixed. They are not concrete. They are just whatever we need to be in the time that we need them. And we may no longer need that old belief. So we'll just revise it. We'll rewrite it. We'll do something different. And if this was a really big deal, if this is a big trigger, if this is something major, again, you might actually have several thoughts, beliefs around that trigger that you have to work through. You may give yourself some freedom, oppose the thought, and then find yourself being triggered again. That doesn't mean you failed. That just means this is a really strong loop. So you'll just do it again. The more that you do this practice, the easier it becomes. The more, it's like any practice, the stronger you get with it. And the less time you have to sit and try to think about the opposite or feel into the thought or release the thought. And it'll be very quick. You'll move through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 with ease, with almost no matter what thought comes up, because you realize that beliefs are changeable, they're malleable, that your emotions, that these things that come up for you are signals to look more deeply within yourself, to consider how you really want to react in this situation, how you really want to manifest your fullest potential. This, my friends, is spiritual work. And again, as a spiritual leader, not only are we doing this work on ourselves because we're human, this may also be something that you bring to friends, colleagues, clients, coworkers, whomever. So, this is the practice of freeing your mind. Again, first, identifying the belief about whatever the event is. And again, the event really doesn't matter, right? We can deal with the event later, especially if the event is actually a problem. It's not always a problem. Sometimes it's a problem, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it just brings something up for us. But we have to deal with our trigger first so we can get out of that unconscious emotional state to really bring conscious awareness and our full capacity, our full agency to this thing that's in front of us. We really want to be able to live our lives with presence, with open heart. It's not possible in a triggered state. So, and again, all of us get triggered. We're human. I do too. Right? I'm just describing humanity here. So hopefully we can get to the belief. That's step 1. What is the belief about the thing? Step 2, feel that belief. It's going to feel some form of bad. Identify it in the body. Step 3, free yourself from that belief. Feel it fully. Identify it in the body. And then step 4, use Patanjali's great advice and figure out what the opposite is and feel into that opposite. Charge that opposite up with some feeling to give yourself not just some space, but some elevated perspective on the situation. Then you can move forward. Then you can fix the issue. Then you can address whatever problem may or may not be in front of you, or you realize, you know what, this is actually no big deal at all. Let's move on with life. Okay, who knows what's going to happen? But you can only get there when you're free. So this is emotional freedom. And everybody, it's been my absolute great honor and pleasure to bring this practice to you. I sincerely hope that it's helpful for you or anybody that you use it with. And again, I did write this all down in my book, Yoga Beyond the Mat, if you need further reference. I have lots and lots of training on both spiritual leadership, yoga, astrology, all of our favorite things on my website, alannak.com. Lots of free resources for you too. And I'm here every week with this podcast, and it is always my great pleasure to bring you some of this wisdom and this work as you rise into your role as a spiritual leader and say yes to this incredible work, because your people need you. They need you, and I'm here to support. Until next time, please take care of yourself and take care of each other.